Okay, so this is tons and tons of information for us. So take lots of notes on this slide. Essentially what we're looking at here, we just went from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. Right, now we're going to go from the anterior pituitary out into the body. We're going to look at all those things that come from the pituitary, like the ACTH, like TSH, like growth hormone, like prolactin. Say, okay, what happens now? When the prolactin goes out into the body, what does it do? What organ does it target, and what does it do with that organ? So let's see, growth hormone, I'm going to actually do in a couple slides on its own separately because it's just a lot that happens. So we'll look at growth hormone separately. FSH and LH, remember these are the reproductive ones. So I just want you to know that they target the testes and ovaries, and that's it. Okay, at the very end, we'll the last chapter, we'll really quickly go through some of the effects. But for right now, just know that we have GnRH from the anterior lobe, that causes the release, or from the hypothalamus, that causes the release of FSH and LH, and they go to the testes and ovaries. All right, so let's talk through the rest of this. ACTH, right? We've got the key up here, and we wrote it on the last slide. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the name gives us a lot of hints. Adreno, where do you think it's going? The adrenal glands. So when we look at the adrenal gland, you guys will see that there's a cortex and a medulla. Adrenocortico, where do you think it's going? The cortex or medulla? The cortex. Adrenocorticotropic means that you're just causing the release of another hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to the adrenal cortex and says, hey, release hormones. So that name right there tells you a lot. Don't dare tell me that adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to the thyroid gland, okay, or the pancreas. Don't do it. The name tells you where it goes. Okay, so ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex and it causes the release of glucocorticoids. Okay, glucocorticoids we'll see later include things like cortisol or hydrocortisone, corticosterone. These are all I was going to tell you, what type of hormones are these? Glucocorticoids. Steroids. Okay, so these are all lipid hormones. These are steroid hormones coming from the adrenal cortex. All right, so that's ACTH. Later, when we look at the adrenal cortex, we'll actually look at these steroids and see what they do and how they're produced and everything. Right now, again, we're just focusing on the anterior pituitary. So we want to know that ACTH is released from the anterior pituitary. That targets the adrenal cortex and says, hey, release glucocorticoids. So TSH, we said, was thyroid stimulating hormone. Which gland do you think it's going to go to? The thyroid gland. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone comes from the anterior pituitary and it goes to the thyroid gland. And it tells the thyroid, it stimulates it, right? It tells the thyroid hormone or the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. We'll talk about them specifically later in today's lecture when we do the thyroid. Growth hormone, I told you we would do separately because it's kind of confusing. Prolactin. God, I thought I had a separate slide on prolactin. No, I don't. Okay, so prolactin comes from the anterior pituitary and it goes to the mammary glands and it stimulates gland development and milk production. Again, if you look at the word prolactin, it's literally like prolactation, right? And lactation is milk production. And so prolactin stimulates gland development during pregnancy and then stimulates milk production after pregnancy or after birth. MSH is a weird one. MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. What do your melanocytes make? Melanin, right? What's melanin for? Gives the skin color, but what does it protect us from? UV radiation, right? And that's what kind of gives us, that's why you tan when you go out in the sun. You get darker because of melanin production. Now, in us, our melanin production is not controlled from the brain, right? What causes your melanocytes to make more melanin? The sun, right? You go out in the sun, you get darker. Like, it's the actual UV exposure that tells your melanocytes to make more melanin than your standard base level. So MSH is not super important in adult humans. It's really important in a lot of other mammals, amphibians, fish, like a lot of other creatures. And in humans, we see that it's really most important in the fetus, for the fetus to start producing that melanin, and in really, really new babies. Interestingly, you do see its effects in adult females when they are pregnant, because some of that MSH gets into the mother's bloodstream. And so if you've ever been pregnant or known anybody or work in an office, what happens when you're pregnant as far as skin color? Right?
Yeah.
They call it like pregnancy mask. You get like these darker patches on your skin, and that's why, because of the MSH that's being released because of the fetus, that affects the mother as well. So you'll get like darker skin patches that occur, and they go away typically, but during the pregnancy you'll see them there. But not super important in normal adults. Okay, so we said that we would separate growth hormone and kind of spread that out a bit because its effects are pretty varied. It's not like a simple 2-bullet thing that we can write down. Now, I will tell you that depending on the textbook you read, they'll explain growth hormone in different ways. So some will say, like the old book used to say, there was this like initial effect that happens, and then later, like when you've eaten and then when you haven't eaten, it acts differently. Some will do like a primary effect and secondary effect. I'm just gonna kind of do this overall discussion of growth hormones so that in somatomedin, so that you know overall what the point is and what's happening. Just again, be aware some textbooks break it up in different ways. So growth hormone again comes from the anterior pituitary gland, and growth hormone works in two kind of separate ways. It has a direct effect on a lot of cells. So growth hormone itself goes out into the bloodstream, and it can go work on your epithelial cells. It can work on cartilage. It can work on numerous cells just itself as growth hormone. Growth hormone also has a secondary effect though. It can go to the liver, so the growth hormone targets the liver and tells the liver to release somatomedins. Okay, these are another set of hormones that go out and affect cells. So you've got growth hormone targeting cells, and then you have growth hormone telling the liver to make somatomedins, and you have the somatomedins going out and affecting cells as well. Some texts will say that the effects of growth hormone are just amplified with the somatomedins. Some will say that it has to do with, like, one works when sugar's high, one works when sugar's low, so that you can continue to grow regardless of the state of your sugar levels. But again, the end effect here is that overall, between the somatomedins and the growth hormone, we stimulate mitosis. What's mitosis in general? Cell division, right? So one cell, like a stem cell, divides and becomes 2 cells. That's just how we replace cells, right? Our skin cells, we constantly lose skin cells. We have to make new ones from somewhere. Our cells get old and they die. Our red blood cells wear out. We've got to make new cells all the time. And we do that via mitosis, right? Or cell division. Mitosis is in most of our cells. Meiosis is if it's our sex cells, but most body cells will divide via mitosis. And then growth hormone also stimulates cell differentiation. Okay, so essentially that's as the cell changes into its specific cell type, right? Because that stem cell can divide and be really basic and really just neutral. And it has to differentiate or grow and change into its specific cell type with specific functions. And then also growth. Okay, so cell division, differentiation, and cell growth, hence being called growth hormone. All right, so growth hormone and somatomedins. Overall, we'll target epithelia, okay, so like our lining tissues, right, our epithelial tissues, and connective tissues, and stimulate cell division and differentiation. This is really important for replacing worn out or lost cells. Again, we just talked about the skin. We constantly lose cells, right? We need to replace them somehow. So growth hormone stimulating this stem cell division and differentiation is very important. We're also going to go to the muscles, bone, and cartilage and cause an increased uptake of amino acids. What do amino acids get made into? Proteins, right? So that these cells will they'll take amino acids from the blood into the cell and turn those amino acids into proteins. Right? So increasing the protein synthesis that's occurring inside the cells. And that contributes to growth of the cell. Right? The cell, like think of your muscle cells. Your muscle cells cannot grow without new proteins being made. They're pretty much all protein, right? So you need to increase the amount of proteins that you're making in order for that muscle cell to be able to grow. Growth hormone stimulates that. It goes to adipose tissue. What's adipose tissue? That's your fat. And in the fat, it has what we call, these are two different things. It has a glucose sparing effect, and you could say it has a protein sparing effect. What this means is that essentially it causes lipid catabolism. What is catabolism? Breakdown, right? Remember chemical reactions, we have anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is when we build things up, like anabolic steroids build up your muscles. Catabolism is when you're breaking things down. And I tell you guys to remember, like a catastrophe, everything gets broken down. So lipid catabolism means that we're breaking down lipids. So triglycerides, which is how we store fats, right? Remember the 3 fatty acids? I told you guys this chemistry was gonna come out and haunt you. Remember triglycerides, you've got that glycerol molecule and you've got the 3 fatty acids that come off of it. That's how we store lipids. That's how we store fatty acids, right? Like this, and you've got the 3 fatty acid tails. These fatty acids can be used for energy, right? We can break down glucose, or we can break down amino acids, or we can break down fatty acids, right? We typically will do glucose, and then we'll do fats, and then if we have to, we'll break down the proteins, but we don't want to break those down because we use them. They're functional. So what growth hormone does is it goes to the fat and it says, let's break down our lipids, right? So these triglycerides get broken down into free fatty acids. That just means we break these off. So now that fatty acid can go be used. You can break it down. You can't use it for energy as a triglyceride. You got to get that 1 fatty acid off in order to burn it. And then it'll say, okay, let's take this fatty acid and go burn it for energy. Let's take this fatty acid and go burn it for energy. So it allows us to break down our triglycerides and use the fatty acids to make ATP instead of glucose and instead of protein. So it's glucose sparing. It spares the glucose because we've got all these fats that you can use. So use these fats, leave the glucose alone. And then the same thing with proteins, right? It's got a protein sparing effect. Don't break down your proteins. So this also helps with growth. You have to spare the proteins, obviously, because the proteins are needed for your cells to grow. The last thing you want to do when you're trying to grow is be using up your proteins for energy, right? Save all of your proteins for cell growth. Use the fat instead. And then some organs are highly dependent on glucose. So the brain, for example, really, really needs glucose. So it has this glucose sparing effect to kind of save up whatever glucose we do have available for those highly glucose dependent organs. And then again, all of the proteins can be used for growth. So overall, if I was going to say, what does growth hormone do? So first off, growth hormone comes from where? What organ? I hear a lot of murmurs and no answers. Where does growth hormone come from? What part of the pituitary? The anterior pituitary. Good. So up here, what's that? Up here. The hypothalamus. If I want more growth hormone, what am I going to release from the hypothalamus? These are really easy. Remember, growth hormone, releasing hormone, okay, or releasing factor. Our growth hormone releasing hormone goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And it tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Now, what does growth hormone do? Growth hormone goes to the liver. And what does it tell the liver to do? Release somatometins. Okay, and then it goes to lots of other cells, and it tells other cells to divide, right? So it increases cell division, differentiation, and growth. And then what does it do at adipose? What kind of effect does it have with the lipids? It increases lipid catabolism. Okay, that's pretty much what I would know about growth hormone. Cells divide, cells start to grow. We break down lipids so that we can use all of our proteins to grow. And we release somatometins that increase all of those effects. And we make proteins. I would add increased protein synthesis to that. Okay, so that's it for the hypothalamus, which releases the releasing and inhibiting hormones that go down to the anterior pituitary. And then that's it for the anterior pituitary, which releases 7 hormones. The posterior pituitary gland, remember, releases the next 2 hormones. Right? The 2 last peptide hormones come from the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary gland, again, we call the neurohypothesis, because remember, the posterior lobe is not actually acting like a gland. It's not producing any of its own hormones. The posterior pituitary actually just has the synaptic terminal, or the synaptic bulb at the end of the axon of neurons that are up in the hypothalamus. So it just has the very end of the neuron located in it. So the neuron actually makes the hormones. They could travel down the axon. They get released right by the capillaries that are present in the posterior pituitary, and then they just enter the blood in the posterior pituitary. It doesn't actually make anything. So again, it contains axons of the hypothalamic neurons, and it's actually the neurons in the hypothalamus that are making ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which we talked about quite a bit already, and then something else called oxytocin, which is going to be involved in the reproductive system. Again, those hormones are then released near the capillaries, the fenestrated capillaries that are present in the posterior pituitary. So all they do is enter the bloodstream in the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary doesn't make any of them. Okay, so let's look at these. Again, this is one where there'll be a lot of extra information for you to write. And I kind of put things in red that I want you to focus on. So, what organ is, or what area of the brain is this up here? The hypothalamus. Okay, so here we have these neurons. The cell body is located up in the brain, the hypothalamus, and you see the axon that stretches all the way down to the posterior pituitary. So when we stimulate these neurons, they then generate an action potential that comes down, and then they end up releasing their hormones down here in the posterior pituitary. That then enters into the bloodstream and then goes throughout the body from the capillaries in the posterior pituitary. Now, when we look at ADH and oxytocin, these hormones are released directly because of some sort of sensory stimulation. Either some sort of a change in the body or some sort of an actual physical stimulus. Something happens in the body and that directly stimulates the release. We don't have releasing hormones. We don't have inhibiting hormones. There's no other chemical above this that's making this happen. Okay, so we don't have the releasing and inhibiting hormones like we did in the anterior pituitary. So let's look at these. We can do ADH first. ADH, again, remember, is antidiuretic hormone. What's diuresis? Peeing. So antidiuretic is like anti-peeing, right? You stop getting rid of fluids and you keep your fluids in. You retain your fluids instead of making urine. So some of the things that would cause us to release ADH from the posterior pituitary. Increased solute concentration of the blood. Okay, so that, I don't know if that sounds confusing or not, but it's like too much stuff, not enough water. Right? Your blood's too concentrated. So essentially you're probably pretty dehydrated. Right? You've got all these solutes in your blood and not enough water. Your blood is just too osmotic. There's too much stuff in it. So you need to hold some water back to dilute your blood a little bit. Decreased blood volume. Okay, so again, like dehydrated, you don't have enough fluid, you don't have enough blood volume, so you need more actual water to increase the volume of your blood, or a decrease in blood pressure. Again, same thing, if your blood volume's gone down, your blood pressure's gone down, you can increase the pressure by increasing how much blood you have, right? Blood volume and blood pressure increase and decrease together. So if any of those things happen, you have sensors that are sensing solute concentration, that are sensing blood pressure and blood volume and blood flow. If any of those things, we sense that any of this is occurring, then we release antidiuretic hormone, okay, ADH, from the posterior pituitary. ADH then goes and acts on the kidneys. At the kidneys, it causes the reabsorption of sodium and water. Okay, so reabsorption of water means we're not putting it out of the urine, we're reabsorbing it back into the body. So that decreases urine production and increases blood volume. Increasing blood volume can increase blood pressure. Now, if this isn't enough, if retaining all of that water at the kidneys isn't enough, ADH can also cause vasoconstriction. What's that going to do to blood pressure? That's going to increase blood pressure. It does that so much, or has such an effect on blood pressure and constriction, that we actually call ADH vasopressin. That's what you'll hear it called clinically a lot. Like, we give vasopressin to patients as a pressor to try and increase their blood pressure when they're crashing because of that constriction. All right, so that's ADH. Just a side, so I always tell you guys, this is something that maybe you can relate to, but when you drink alcohol, alcohol inhibits ADH. So now you cannot release this ADH. So that's why antidiuretic is anti-peeing. If you get rid of anti-peeing, you pee. That's why, like, people are like, oh, you broke the seal, you feel like you're peeing all the time. It's not just because you're putting fluid in, it's because you're getting rid of your ADH. So you don't have the ability to hold back fluid anymore or hold back water, and you just start producing urine just constantly. So when you drink a lot of alcohol, you actually produce way more urine. That's one of the reasons, like, why a hangover occurs, because you get dehydrated. You don't have the ability to stop and say, wow, my blood's too concentrated, I need to hold fluid back. Or, wow, I don't have enough blood volume, I need to stop making urine and keep this fluid in. You lose that ability. So you start just urinating out all of your fluid and then end up dehydrated and end up, the headache and the hangover afterwards because of it. Okay, so that's that. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is, again, it's made up in the hypothalamus because of sensory stimulation. And there's all different types of sensory stimulation. We'll talk about it in a second. And then it's released from the posterior pituitary gland. Again, oxytocin is part of the reproductive system. So oxytocin in women can go one to the mammary glands to cause the ejection of milk. Prolactin causes the production of milk. So you make milk because of prolactin, but you actually eject it from the nipples because of oxytocin. So what oxytocin does is it causes smooth muscle, oh, I think it's down there. It causes smooth muscle contraction. So if you have smooth muscles that are lining the ducts out of the mammary glands, those smooth muscles contract and you can release the milk from the glands. Now again, the release of this oxytocin is stimulated by sensory stimulation. So again, if you've had a baby or known anybody who's breastfed, it's sensory stimulation and it takes a second and then the milk is released. Okay, so it's not like you just like the baby has to suckle, right? And you've heard like the term milk letdown. That milk letdown is that period when the oxytocin is being released and then telling the smooth muscle to contract and eject that milk. So normally, again, the infant suckles, or sometimes other sensory stimulation will cause the release, like hearing a baby cry, or thinking about it, even like if you have a routine, you grab this, you grab that, you sit down in the chair, like that's your routine. Your brain knows this is what happens, and then we breastfeed. So when you start doing that routine, the oxytocin will start getting released, and then that will stimulate the milk letdown, where the milk can actually be ejected from the breasts. Uterine contraction. Okay, so this is during birth, when the uterus contracts in order to expel the baby from the uterus. That's because of oxytocin. Okay, and we actually give synthetic oxytocin to patients. So if a patient's labor has stalled, we'll give them Pitocin, which is oxytocin, and that literally stimulates the uterus to start contracting to push the baby out. Again, this is sensory stimulation, right? You feel a little contraction, okay? That actual sensation of a little contraction causes the release of oxytocin. That oxytocin causes a bigger contraction. That's more sensory stimulation, so that causes more oxytocin. That causes a bigger contraction. That's more sensory stimulation. That causes more oxytocin. So that's one of those positive feedback loops where the actual sensation of the contraction causes more of it to be released to cause an even bigger contraction. Okay, so in females, oxytocin causes the ejection of milk. What hormone causes the production of milk? Prolactin, good. And it causes smooth muscle contraction in the uterus during childbirth. Men also have oxytocin. Oxytocin goes again to smooth muscles to cause contraction. And the ductus deferens, so from each of the testes, you have, so sperm are made down in the testes, and then you have the ductus deferens, these two tubes that bring the sperm up and back to the back of the prostate gland. And there's a seminal duct that makes some of the seminal components, and then the prostate gland makes some of the components that go into the semen. But essentially all of this stuff ends up getting combined to make ejaculate, right? When the male ejaculates and ejects the sperm from the body. So the oxytocin is involved in the actual ejection. So the actual releasing of that ejaculate from the man's body and out through the urethra. Sensory stimulation, again, causes this to happen. I'll let you use your imaginations on what that sensory stimulation is. There's a variety. But yeah, that causes the release of oxytocin, and oxytocin causes the release of the ejaculate. There are some other kind of theories here that oxytocin has something to do with sexual arousal and maybe bonding, but this is kind of like what comes first? Like, is the oxytocin because of to stimulate sexual arousal, or is the oxytocin just high because you were sexually aroused and you had an orgasm? Or is the oxytocin having to do with the bonding, or are you bonding because you're breastfeeding, or are you bonding because of the sexual interaction you just had? So it's kind of hard to tell what emotional response is occurring because of it, or if it's just happening at the same time. But these are the things we know for sure. Okay, that's it for the pituitary.